think of this. For thousands of years, trillions of these human brain cells, trillions of brain cells for thousands of years have been thinking, scheming, and dreaming about how to grab land and resources from other human beings. This has been the human condition. Win, lose. How can my side win and that other side's not of God? So they gotta lose. God's on my side. So that's sort of how it's been. But every now and then, through the ages, we'll say 4,000 to 5,000 years at least, there's been this light come forward, where instead of us versus them, it becomes all of us together. It's become a society where we all realize there's a consciousness here, as we know. There's been enough elevated consciousness for the human beings living in at least that region to have realized we're all in this together, and there's only one land that we have, and we must fairly share it because we're tired of the bloody wars. So until we get this, I'm just going to go through it without the pictures. I was all working a few minutes ago. So this is called the Golden Thread of Perennial Wisdom Teachings on Land. Push it forward, push down. Economic principles in the Vedic. We're going to go through ancient 4,000 or 5,000 years ago Vedic India. We're going to go to the Middle East. We're going to go to China. Back home here to Henry George, of course. And I'm going to do it all in 20 minutes, 5,000 years. Nicholas Kazanis is a Greek-born Georgia scholar of Vedic history, Indology, and the culture in the Indus Valley back to 5,000 years ago. Moving me forward. And then,
Have fun.
yeah, I can't even read it off the here now.
We were just in the slideshow and it wasn't showing anything, so I just was zooming in on what we had.
The study, his book, Vedic Teachings, Economic Teachings in the Veda, deals with principles as found in these ancient sources and principles of unchanging and eternal quality. Page down, I hope. The work of wise lawgivers in the remote antiquity of the Vedic period shows the same concern about the distribution of wealth that occupies the mind of modern economists. The ancient Indian codes, these sages instituted their laws. They fully realized the bodily needs for wholeness, food, shelter, locomotion, assembly, property, peace, physical work, and spiritual development. You might say they were holistic. The Vedas and land value taxation, a most surprising feature, is the principle of free access to land for all, and the land value tax, which should be the source of government revenue. It's surprising because land value taxation is supposed to be a fairly modern concept. There is a concept of rent or surplus, a higher charge on the more fertile areas. That's all from his book. So we see these basic principles, land tenure in the Vedic age. The land is divine entity, it belongs to the whole of mankind, belongs to all men equally. The whole community holds the region where it lives. And yet land is cultivated by individuals or families, not jointly, by the community. And it brings us back to the sentiment in our Leviticus and our biblical, and that is inscribed on our Liberty Bell. Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. Which brings us to the Middle East and the early Christian land ethic, which echoed the Old Testament teachings, those old Levitical teachings. The land must not be sold beyond reclaim. The land is mine. You're but strangers resident with me. Dr. Dossie read that this morning. The profit of the earth is for all. Ecclesiastes. Isaiah, woe unto them. Charles read this one. That join house to house, that lay field to field, till there be no place for anyone else. And Nehemiah, restore, I pray you, to them even this day their lands, their vineyards, their olive yards, and their houses. So land tenure described in Leviticus. Those with poorer land were to be given more acreage. Those with more fertile land would be given less. But what about land locations regarding the marketplace? Now this might be kind of pretty interesting if you haven't come across it yet. It's from the land question in the Talmud from a few decades ago. Solomon Solis Cohen is from the Gemara, Bala Batra. And so the rabbis are thinking, well, upon the more valuable land holdings was to be imposed a tax or lease fee, the measure of which was the excess of their value over a given standard. The fund created was to be paid out in due proportions to those holding lands in less favorable locations. They were trying to figure out, well, we've divided up the land by land soil quality. What about some will be living closer to the market, Jerusalem usually, and others will be further out. They're at a disadvantage. How do you make laborers access to land fair when you have locational disadvantage like that? So as for that, the adjustment to be made by money, that is to say those holding land nearer the city, Jerusalem usually should pay into the common treasury the estimated excess value pertaining to it by reason of the superior situation, while those holding land of less value by reason of its distance from the city would receive from the treasury a money compensation. Doesn't it sound pretty similar to what we're talking about? Do you think so? In this, we see affirmed the doctrine that natural advantages are common property and may not be diverted to private gain. So the land ethic, early Christian communities, as Charles talked this morning, koinonia, meaning essentially that God was the sole earner of the earth, given for the, and he pronounced it better than I knew how previously, I think autarkia, the self-reliant livelihood of all. So now this, I'm going to see how my time's even doing, kind of dip. I think I'm doing okay. Do I have 15 minutes left still? Fairly quickly through a very interesting presentation given by Peter Baumann in 2013 at our International Union for Land Value Tax conference in London. And he had done a very substantive survey of the 4,000 years of taxing the land in China. Doesn't mean they taxed it in China for 4,000 years. Through all these dynasties, which were not the same land boundaries, of course, as modern China, but it's that region we're talking about. These several dynasties, and that gives a time zone in relation to the West, ancient Greece, Rome, medieval Renaissance, and up pretty much to our present day. You see all those different dynasties had different land boundaries, but it was all in that region. So what you can see here, and this is going to be a brief touch, is the rise and fall of civilization based on land tenure. When the land was fairly shared, you had the peace and harmonic situation. When a few grabbed more, you had the downfall of the dynasty. In order to have real power through acknowledgement of a new regime, that regime would often come to, again, a fair land distribution or some method of doing that so that the people would respect the new power structure. Sometimes that's how it worked. And you'll see kind of some details here. So Xia Dynasty, now 2100 to 1600 BCE, the land was distributed following the Great Flood. Peter is looking at lessons learned from each of these dynasties. So this is the land belongs to the people at large. Qing Dynasty, this looks a little like tic-tac-toe. Maybe it came from this. This was, in this dynasty, you had this roughly sized pattern where you had, in the purple, the private land tenure. Equal size of, this is looking agriculture. And then you had a plot in the middle that was the common plot that they would then share in the taking care of, share in the growing of the crops in that common plot. And maybe that blue was like a tool shed that they would all share something in common, some capital. Could be the blue, a building or something. But then that green spot is what they then use for their common needs. So not like a land value tax, but it's still a method of fairly sharing so that the individual balance with those common needs of the community. So lesson, the best method of public revenue is when you don't appropriate what people regard as their private property. Xiao Dynasty, land allocated for use, penalties for not using allocated land. Amount of land allocated depends on fertility, and public revenue divided into first gift, then aid. I don't understand all that part myself, but there's a requirement to provide produce and military equipment into the commons, progressive taxation of feudal chiefs. Lesson 3, the basis of allocation on land should be use. If it's not used, it's liable to be reclaimed and otherwise used. Han Dynasty, private ownership of land. The rich own thousands of Mao, while the poor have not even enough land to stand on. So on this one is when the powerful landowners influence the government. The two sources of production are labor and land, and in order that all land capable of producing crops might be cultivated and all hands engaged in agricultural use, taxes on land should be abolished. Now, what this is the corruption. This is the rationale of the big landowners for taxing production on them. And they're actually using the argument for, we would use for taxing land, they're using it against them. They're saying, don't tax us, it's limiting our productivity. So, with Han Dynasty, those low taxes on land, tenants paying higher rent, the poll tax. So lesson 4, there will not be an effective land tax when there's unrestrained private ownership of land. I think we know that. Tang Dynasty. That's just showing the rough footprint of that dynasty. Yangon tax reforms, summer and autumn levy. People were not taxed according to their age, which at times they were taxed according to their age, but according to their wealth or the amount of land possessed. Lesson 6, a tax on land is better than a tax on people. And then order was restored, distribution of land reestablished. Tang Dynasty, lesson 5, it's possible to move back from unrestrained private ownership to government allocation of land. Ming Dynasty, it was effective, but the tax roll became obsolete. They started taxing other things, additional levies. Song Dynasty, source of public revenue, rent from public land, farm rents, urban rents, poll tax, and other taxes. Qing Dynasty, I'm going to kind of move along. I want to make sure I get to the other parts. Lesson 7, an effective land tax needs regular updating of land values. Gee, that sounds pretty much like us, I think. That was a long time ago. Okay, Sun Yat-sen, considered the father of modern China. The teachings of Henry George will be the basis of our program of reform. The land tax as the only means of supporting the government is an infinitely just, reasonable, and equitable distributed tax, and on it we will found our new system. We don't think he studied 4,000 years of China and land tenure to get to this. What he was finding out about was a province, an area in China that had been settled by German military people who were Georgists, and they began a Georgist land value tax system in that area of China, which was really taking off, was bringing a lot of notice in its development, and moving towards out of the very rural development situation, really moving ahead. So he heard about that, and then he got into that, and that's how he heard about Henry George and read Progress and Poverty. So look how it loops around the world. You're going to see even more looping with the physiocrats, as we know, considered the founders of modern economics and the philosopher, medical doctors, advisors to the kings of France. And so we always assume when Adam Smith came with his tutor to Paris to study with the physiocrats, somehow these smart men had studied the wealth flows in France, and they had come to the realization that you should have the single tax on land. Isn't that what we usually thought about the physiocrats? I know I did. So they coined the phrase impôt unique, single tax, urged the French kings to levy taxes on land instead of labor. And one of the Enlightenment's wise men, Mirabeau the Elder, held their discovery would be if enacted a social advance equal to the inventions of writing and money. But here's the interesting part. Where did the idea come from? Quesnay is known for his writings on Chinese politics and society. Because of his admiration of Confucianism, Quesnay's followers bestowed him with the title Confucius of Europe. Many tax principles put forth by him and other physiocrats were derived from land and tax policies of the dynasties of China. And I came across a paper just a few months ago. It's the writings by Tan Yin. Can't give you the URL right now. But does details all these tax policies that the physiocrats put forth, exactly how they got them from ancient China. How many do that? So, what? All right, we're here. Eight more slides and 7 more minutes. Adam Smith wrote in his classic Wealth of Nations that both ground rent and the ordinary rent of lands are a species of revenue which the owner in many cases enjoys without any care or attention of his own. Ground rents seem, in this respect, a more proper subject of peculiar taxation. Really a different use of the term peculiar. It really meant in his time more special taxation. Nothing can be more reasonable than that a fund which owes its existence to the good government of the state should be taxed peculiarly. So many writings that Adam Smith was onto it, but he had certain patrons that he shouldn't talk too loud about the land problem. So now we're going to Karl Marx. We're going to the Communist Manifesto. Some of you are not going to like that at all. But we have to see, because some of us are very committed to moving forward center, beyond the old right and the old left, which is tearing our country apart, just ripping us up, this right-left divide, Republican, Democrat. And so we really need to show there is a kernel of great wisdom that is on both sides from their major spokespeople. So much so that the first point of the Communist Manifesto is the abolition of property and land and application of all rents of land to public purpose. Now we know that you can take the seed and leave the kernel. We don't have to nationalize land. We know the technique of how you just simply take the rent and allow the private property and land, private use rights, and all the benefits of that, but you extract the community-created land rent. So what a great thing to say, hey, you guys coming from the left, and most all left, you're going to pretty much trace back to the communist ideas, have them really look at this and have the discussion based on number one. Now, I couldn't resist, I'm sorry, to put these two guys in the same slide. Milton Friedman, land should be taxed as much as possible, and improvements as little as possible, and Karl. And as you might know, but he really got to the land problem in his Das Kapital Part 3. There's wonderful, juicy quotes. He has extensive writings on ground rent. And he really was starting to see, and he writes this, that it's really the land problem, that if the land problem is solved, you can have a monopoly capitalism, that's the primary problem. But I've been to conferences with Marxist scholars on the podium, and I've mentioned Part 3 of Das Kapital and quoted, and you've never seen such blank stares in your life as these Marxist scholars and no clue about this part. I think Karl Marx was not a Marxist by the time he got to Part 3.
How amazing you wrote Part 3 before you wrote Part 1.
Rent is extracted by the landowner. Maybe I should read from here. Despite the palpable and complete passiveness of the owner, whose sole activity consists in exploiting the progress of social development, towards which he risks nothing, and for which he contributes nothing, and for which he risks nothing, unlike the industrial capitalist. How about that? Wonderful quote from George: it's not enough that men should vote, not enough that they be theoretically equal before the law. They must have liberty to avail themselves of the opportunities and means of life. They must stand on equal terms with reference to the bounty of nature. We must make land common property. And the specifics of what that means, I love this part of our International Declaration on Individual and Common Rights to the Earth, which states, the exercise of both common and individual rights in land is essential to a society based on justice. But the rights of individuals in natural resources are limited by the just rights of the community. Denying the existence of common rights in land creates a condition of society wherein the exercise of individual rights becomes impossible for the great mass of people. Is that not true today? And this was written 50, 60 years ago when the IU was founded. And he's clapping. Clapping at the truth. So we have the emergent commons movement. Once more, again, the perennial wisdom teachings get back, understand the commons. Wonderful bridging work to be done in our future with the commons movement and our policy solutions in terms of tax and public finance. But I wanted to draw attention to this from Global Commons Trust, James Quilligan, who's acknowledged leader in the commons thinking website. Our commons are the collective heritage of humanity, the shared resources of nature and society that we inherit, create, and use. People across the world are now rediscovering these common goods and choosing to protect them for future generation. We had Eleanor Ostrom talk just yesterday, and she's received the Nobel Prize in Economics for her work on the commons. So the equal right of all men and women to the use of land is as clear as their equal right to breathe the air. It is a right proclaimed by the fact of their existence. For we cannot suppose that some men and women have a right to be in this world and others do not. So here are the fundamental earth wisdom and earth rights wisdom. To enable thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Thank you.